What if the strangest wounds of war were not left on bodies or cities, but on reality itself? World War II is often remembered through maps, dates, and the terrible arithmetic of loss. We tell it through troop movements, speeches, factories, graves. We place it inside the language of strategy because strategy feels measurable, and what is measurable feels safe. Yet beneath the official record, beyond the headlines of victory and ruin, there are other stories that linger in the margins like fingerprints on old glass. They come from radar rooms and frozen forests, from pilots staring into bright air, and soldiers stumbling through silence. In each account, something familiar gives way. Time slips. Space misbehaves. Instruments fail in ways machines are not supposed to fail. Men trained to trust procedure find themselves standing before events that seem to belong less to warfare than to dream, memory, or some hidden crack in the physical world. Perhaps these stories are only the byproducts of exhaustion, fear, and the unbearable strain of combat. That is one possibility, and an honest one. War distorts perception. It bends the mind under pressures few of us can truly imagine. But another possibility remains, quieter and more unsettling, that under extreme conditions, the world itself can begin to flicker, exposing patterns we do not yet understand. This is not a tale about secret empires or easy conspiracies. It is about human beings meeting the limits of explanation. It is about the moments when witnesses reached for ordinary words and found they were no longer enough. A vanished contact on a radar screen. A formation of aircraft that should not exist. A pocket of silence where even time seemed to hesitate. History usually asks what happened. These stories ask something more difficult. What happens when reality no longer behaves like the history books promised it would? And if war can reveal the best and worst of human nature, perhaps it can also reveal how little we truly know about the world we pass through, believing it is solid, continuous, and understood. It began with a screen glowing in a darkened room. In the early years of radar, operators learned to read the invisible, a sweep of light, a brief mark, a pulse returning from somewhere beyond the coast. It was a new kind of sight, mechanical and abstract, yet no less intimate. On those screens, war first appeared as tremors in the dark. Then came the reports that did not fit. Over Britain, over the Channel, and later across other theaters of war, trained observers described contacts that emerged without warning and disappeared with equal speed. Sometimes they moved too fast for the aircraft of the time. Sometimes they hovered where nothing should hover. Pilots were sent to intercept shapes that vanished before arrival, as though the sky had created a signal and then thought better of it. In some cases, the explanation was simple. Weather could distort a reading. Layers of warm and cold air could bend radio waves and create ghosts on the display. New technology, used under stress, naturally produced error. But that answer did not satisfy everyone who stood watch through those long nights, headphones pressed close, eyes fixed on the rotating line. They knew the difference between a machine's stutter and something that seemed to answer back. For the men and women in those radar rooms, uncertainty became part of the landscape. They were not just listening for planes. They were listening for intention. Every unexplained mark carried the weight of possible disaster. A false alarm could waste precious minutes. A real one could cost a city. And so the mystery was never merely technical. It was human. It lived in the space between signal and judgment, between what appeared and what could be trusted. In war, even a flicker becomes a question of survival. Perhaps that is why these early radar enigmas still matter. They remind us that every new instrument extends our reach, but it also enlarges the frontier of doubt. The more clearly we try to see, the more we discover how much of the world still arrives as a blur. It started, as many mysteries do, with light. Pilots flying night missions during the war began to report glowing spheres pacing their aircraft through the dark. They appeared over Europe and the Pacific, sometimes red, sometimes white or amber, moving with an eerie calm. They did not attack. They did not signal. They simply followed, as if curiosity itself had taken shape in the sky. Air crews gave them names in the half-humorous language people use when fear needs softening. To some, they were tricks of the eyes brought on by fatigue, reflections on the cockpit glass, electrical phenomena dancing in storm-heavy air. To others, they felt more deliberate than that. The lights seemed to respond, holding formation, matching speed, and then vanishing at the exact moment pursuit became possible. The wartime sky was already a theater of confusion. Searchlights crossed through cloud. Anti-aircraft fire burst in black flowers. Engines strained, nerves thinned. Under those conditions, perception could easily fray. Scientists later pointed to ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, optical distortions, and the chemistry of exhausted minds under relentless pressure. None of those explanations are unreasonable. In fact, they may explain much of what was seen, and yet the reports endure because they reveal something deeper than an unsolved aerial event. They reveal how human beings confront the unknown when there is no time for contemplation, only reaction. Imagine being thousands of feet above the ground, sealed inside a machine of metal and noise, and watching a silent light drift just outside your wing. No language of training truly prepares a person for that. The mystery, then, is not only what those lights were, it is what they became in memory. For the men who saw them, they were interruptions in the logic of war, moments when the machinery of conflict gave way to something almost intimate and unplaceable. Not hostile, not friendly, simply present. Sometimes the strangest thing is not danger, but ambiguity. A weapon can be named, a target can be mapped, but a light that follows you through the night asks a different question. Not how to fight, but how to understand. And history is full of moments when understanding arrives much later, if it arrives at all. It was supposed to be one of the safest places in the world. A locked room, a sealed project, a calculation kept under armed guard. The race to understand the atom was driven by urgency, fear, and the knowledge that science had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. In laboratories hidden behind fences and silence, physicists learned to describe forces so small they could not be seen, yet powerful enough to alter history. They measured particles, split matter, and turned theory into consequence. But even in that disciplined world, there were moments when the atom seemed less like an object of study than a door opening onto something unsettlingly vast. Workers on the Manhattan Project lived in a strange tension between precision and uncertainty. Equations governed everything, yet the behavior of matter at the smallest scale refused to feel fully human in its logic. Neutrons moved without ceremony. Radiation passed invisibly through walls, skin, and time. The closer researchers came to mastery, the more they were reminded that nature was not obliged to make itself comfortable to the mind trying to describe it. Some of the mysteries were practical and immediate. Unexpected criticality risks, material behaviors that defied assumption, invisible exposure that announced itself only later, in illness or damage already done. Other mysteries were philosophical, though no less real. What did it mean that reality, at its foundation, seemed built on probabilities rather than certainties? What kind of world reveals itself only when it is broken apart? For the scientists involved, the atom was not merely a weapon. It was a revelation that human knowledge could outrun human wisdom. They had entered the hidden architecture of matter and found no moral instruction waiting there, only power, pattern, and silence. That may be the most enduring mystery of all. Not that the atom was difficult to understand, but that understanding it changed the scale of human responsibility forever. In the smallest fragments of the world, we discovered immense force, and in doing so, we were forced to ask whether knowledge is ever just knowledge, or whether every discovery eventually turns back toward the hands that made it possible. It began with footprints where no one should have been. Across battlefields and remote military zones, war created a strange archive of things half seen and poorly understood. Soldiers reported voices in empty places, shapes crossing ruined ground, movements in forests that disappeared when approached. Most of these accounts were never formal mysteries. They lived in letters, campfire retellings, private confessions, and the uneasy silence between men who had witnessed more than they could comfortably explain. One story repeated itself in different forms. Signs of presence in abandoned areas. Tracks in snow leading nowhere. Equipment disturbed overnight. Figures glimpsed at the edge of fog or smoke. Too far to identify and too vivid to forget. In ordinary life, such moments might have become local folklore. In wartime, they took on a sharper edge. Every unexplained trace might signal an enemy nearby, a hidden patrol, or a mind pushed past its limit by fear and fatigue. There are sensible explanations, and they matter. Combat erodes sleep, trust, and perception. Snow shifts, shadows deceive. Memory rearranges itself under stress, smoothing gaps and amplifying the emotional truth of what was felt. The human brain is built to find patterns, especially when survival depends on noticing the slightest irregularity. In war, that instinct can save a life. It can also populate emptiness with meaning, but something remains haunting in these accounts, even when we grant the mind its role in shaping them. They reveal how conflict changes the very texture of reality. A forest stops being a forest. It becomes a place of possible ambush. A sound in the dark is never just a sound. The world grows crowded with intention, and the imagination, sharpened by danger, begins to act almost like another sense. Perhaps that is why these wartime apparitions linger in memory, not because they prove anything supernatural, but because they expose how thin the boundary can be between the seen and the inferred. Under extreme pressure, the mind does not simply observe the world, it collaborates with it, filling silence with possibility. And maybe that is one of war's quietest tragedies. Not only that it destroys landscapes and lives, but that it teaches people to doubt even the ground beneath their own perception. What if the sea keeps its deepest secrets, not because they are impossible to solve, but because water has a way of erasing the shape of certainty? During the war, oceans became vast corridors of peril. Convoys crossed great distances under the threat of submarines. Ships vanished in storms, in battle, in silence. Some were found only years later. Others slipped beneath the surface and left behind almost nothing but fractured signals, uncertain coordinates, and the testimony of those who watched them disappear. In naval warfare, mystery was woven into the environment itself. A ship might be visible one moment and gone the next behind fog, smoke, or the curvature of the sea. Sonar could suggest movement where there was none. Depth charges exploded in darkness below, against enemies no one could see directly. Decisions had to be made from echoes, fragments, and intuition. In that world, absence became one of the most terrifying forms of evidence. Some wartime disappearances were later explained by torpedoes, mines, rogue weather, or navigational error. Others remained clouded by conflicting records and the unreliability of memory under extreme stress. Survivors remembered timings differently. Logs were incomplete. Messages broke off mid-transmission. The sea preserved the event but concealed the sequence. Even now, some wrecks answer only part of the question, not whether they sank, but how the final moments unfolded. That uncertainty carries a particular emotional weight. On land, destruction leaves ruins. At sea, loss is often swallowed whole. There is no final room to walk through, no street to revisit, no visible scar that tells the story back to us. Families waited for letters that never came. Crews became names in ledgers. History, confronted by water, learned humility. Perhaps that is why maritime mysteries from the war still feel so intimate. They are not only puzzles of engineering or combat, they are meditations on disappearance itself, on how quickly the world can close over an event and return to its surface calm, on how memory struggles when there is nothing to hold. The ocean does not argue. It does not explain. It receives what falls into it and keeps moving. And maybe that is what unsettles us most. The thought that even in an age of machines, maps, and military record, so much of human experience can still vanish into depth, leaving us with the only questions in the sound of waves against the dark. It started with a sound no one could place. In wartime skies and along isolated fronts, people sometimes described hearing engines where no aircraft appeared, footsteps where no patrol could be found, voices carried across impossible distances. War is loud, of course, but it is also full of interruptions in sound. Long silences, sudden gaps, echoes bent by weather, terrain, and fear. In those unstable acoustics, the ordinary world could begin to feel strangely rearranged. For radio operators, this uncertainty was part of daily life. Messages faded, returned, and sometimes arrived tangled with fragments that seemed to belong to no known source. Signals bounced off the atmosphere and traveled farther than expected. Static could imitate speech just well enough to unsettle the listener. A call sign half heard in the night might send men searching for an aircraft already lost, or a unit that had never been there at all. There are scientific reasons for much of this. Temperature layers can carry sound in surprising ways. Mountains, water, and cloud cover can distort direction. Radio propagation, especially in wartime conditions, can behave with maddening irregularity. A voice may seem close when it is far away. A distant engine may sound as if it is circling directly overhead. The ear, like the eye, does not simply receive reality, it interprets it. And yet these auditory mysteries remain powerful because sound reaches us differently than sight. A sound enters the body. It stirs instinct before thought. You can close your eyes to danger, but not your hearing. That is why an unexplained noise in war carries such force. It bypasses reason and goes straight to anticipation, to dread, to memory. Many veterans later spoke less about what they saw than what they heard and could never forget. The drone of something unseen, the call that may have been real, the silence afterward, heavier than noise. In those moments, mystery was not abstract. It was intimate, almost physical, pressing against the nerves. Perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside these wartime echoes. The world is never as cleanly separated as we imagine. Signal and interference, truth and mishearing, presence and absence all move through the same air. And sometimes what haunts us most is not the thing itself, but the sound of it arriving from somewhere we cannot find. It began with photographs that seemed to argue with time. War has always depended on images, aerial reconnaissance, field documentation, snapshots carried in pockets, film reels shipped across oceans. In World War II, photography became both witness and weapon, a way of proving what the eye might miss and preserving what destruction would soon erase. Yet some images from that era left behind a peculiar unease, not because they were fabricated, but because they seemed to capture more than anyone knew how to explain. There were blurred forms where nothing had been reported, shadows that appeared out of proportion to the objects that cast them, figures at the edge of the frame whose presence could not later be confirmed. Most of these anomalies were likely technical: double exposures, damaged negatives, lens distortions, hurried development in improvised darkrooms. Photography, especially under battlefield conditions, was never as objective as people wanted to believe. Every image passed through chemistry, timing, motion, and human expectation. Still, the camera carried a special authority. When memory faltered, a photograph felt solid. It said, "This was here, this happened." And that is precisely why ambiguous images can be so haunting. They do not merely confuse the eye, they unsettle our trust in evidence itself. If the camera, that mechanical witness, can produce uncertainty, then certainty becomes harder to locate than we imagine. For soldiers and civilians alike, wartime photographs often served as anchors against disappearance. They preserved faces before deployment, streets before bombing, landscapes before history remade them. But some images did something stranger. They seemed to hold an excess of atmosphere, as if fear, haste, and grief had seeped into the emulsion along with light. Looking at them now, we are not just seeing a scene, we are encountering the limits of what an image can tell us. Perhaps that is why these visual mysteries endure. Not because they prove hidden forces at work, but because they reveal how fragile the boundary is between record and interpretation. A photograph does not end a question. Sometimes it begins one. And maybe that is the deeper truth of all archives. They preserve the outline of a moment, but never the whole of it. The rest remains outside the frame, waiting in silence, asking us how much of the past can ever really be seen. What happens when a machine fails at the precise moment human beings need it most? World War II is often remembered as a triumph of engineering as much as endurance. Radar, code breaking, aviation, cryptography, industrial production. It was an age that placed enormous faith in systems, in the belief that enough invention and discipline could reduce chaos to calculation. But war also exposed how fragile that confidence could be. Sometimes the most unsettling mystery was not an enemy weapon or a strange sight in the sky. It was the sudden refusal of a trusted machine to behave. Pilots described instruments spinning into nonsense without obvious cause. Compasses drifted. Altimeters gave readings that did not fit the terrain below. Radios cut out in crucial moments. then returned as if nothing had happened. Navigators, trained to rely on precise relationships between number and direction, found themselves suspended between data and instinct. In peace, a malfunction is a technical problem. In war, it becomes existential. There are many plausible explanations. Extreme cold could damage systems. Vibration could knock delicate components out of calibration. Electrical interference, poor maintenance, battle damage, and simple manufacturing limits all played their part. Technology in the 1940s was remarkable, but it was still vulnerable, still temperamental, still deeply dependent on the humans operating it under extraordinary strain. And sometimes those humans, exhausted and frightened, may have remembered a failure as stranger than it was. But the emotional truth remains. These episodes revealed how quickly confidence can collapse when the instruments go dark. A person can survive uncertainty in the abstract. It is much harder to endure when every dial meant to orient you begins quietly withdrawing its promise. In those moments, the war became more than a struggle against other nations. It became a confrontation with the possibility that knowledge itself might flicker. Perhaps that is why mechanical mysteries from the war still resonate. They remind us that every civilization builds devices to protect itself from ambiguity. Yet those devices are never fully separate from the uncertainty they were designed to master. We invent tools to steady our place in the world. Then sooner or later, the world asks whether steadiness was ever ours to keep. It started in places where maps seemed to lose confidence. Remote mountains, dense forests, frozen roads, islands reduced to coordinates on a briefing sheet. World War II forced people into landscapes they did not know and often could not fully read. In those environments, the land itself became part of the mystery. Routes vanished beneath snow. Valleys altered the weather without warning. Familiar distances stretched or collapsed under exhaustion. Men followed compasses, stars, and orders, only to find themselves somewhere that did not seem to match any expectation. Soldiers and aircrews sometimes described terrain with a kind of disbelief, as though the world had shifted while they were moving through it. A ridge appeared where none had been expected. A river could not be found. A landmark seen from above became unrecognizable on the ground. Under battle conditions, these confusions had obvious causes: poor visibility, inaccurate maps, stress, cold, hunger, and fear. Even so, the emotional texture of those reports remains striking. They do not read only as navigational errors. They read as encounters with a world withdrawing its clarity. Geography is never neutral in war. It shapes strategy, but it also shapes perception. Snow flattens contrast. Fog erases depth. Darkness removes edges. Forests repeat themselves until direction feels circular. In such places, the mind reaches for certainty and often finds only approximation. The result is not always panic. Sometimes it is stranger than panic, a quiet conviction that one has stepped outside ordinary orientation into a space where the world is still real but no longer legible. Many wartime mysteries grew from precisely that condition. People were not merely lost. They were briefly severed from the reassuring bond between landscape and meaning. The ground beneath them continued to exist, but its signals had become unreadable. And when the environment stops making sense, human beings are left facing something ancient: the fear of being small in a vast and indifferent world. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They remind us that history is not made only in capitals and command rooms, but also in the lonely places where human certainty thins out. A map can describe a territory. It cannot fully contain the experience of crossing it in darkness, listening for danger, hoping the horizon will once again become something you can trust. It began after the event was over. For many who lived through World War II, the deepest mystery did not occur on the battlefield at all. It arrived later, sometimes years later, in memory. A detail returned with impossible sharpness. A sequence no longer matched the official record. Two witnesses remembered the same night as if they had inhabited different worlds. The war had ended, but the mind kept reopening it, rearranging shadows, preserving fragments, and erasing what it could not bear. This is one of the most intimate mysteries of all. Not what happened in the world, but what happened inside the people who survived it. Trauma alters recollection in ways both subtle and profound. Some moments are sealed away. Others grow larger with time. Sounds remain when faces vanish. A smell, a patch of light, the angle of rain on a road can outlast whole months of chronology. The mind does not archive experience like a ledger. It protects, distorts, repeats, and sometimes invents pathways simply to keep living. That does not make wartime memory false. It makes it human. Veterans who spoke of strange events, lost hours, impossible coincidences, or scenes that felt dreamlike were not always describing mystery in the scientific sense. Often they were describing the collision between reality and the mind's effort to survive it. What seems inexplicable may be, in part, the shape that pain takes when ordinary language cannot contain it. And yet memory is not only distortion, it is also witness. Without it, history becomes sterile, reduced to documents and logistics. Memory brings back the trembling hand, the silent pause before an answer, the look in someone's eyes when they try to name what they saw. It carries emotion across time. It reminds us that facts alone do not complete a human story. Perhaps that is why the unresolved memories of war continue to matter. They ask us to approach the past with humility. Not every contradiction is deception. Not every uncertainty is error. Sometimes two things can be true at once. The record can be incomplete, and the recollection can be wounded. In the end, memory may be war's last battlefield, not because it seeks victory, but because it keeps struggling to turn survival into meaning. And that struggle, more than any single mystery, may be what history owes its deepest attention to. What if the true mystery was never any single event, but the pattern they formed when placed side by side? By the later years of the war, unexplained moments had accumulated like small tears in a larger fabric. Strange lights, vanishing signals, faulty instruments, missing ships, echoes without, each could be approached alone, explained in part, absorbed into weather, fatigue, physics, or fear. And often that is exactly where honest inquiry should begin. But when taken together, these stories reveal something more enduring than a collection of anomalies. They reveal the atmosphere of an age pushed to the edge of comprehension. War compresses human experience. It accelerates invention, sharpens perception, and overloads the senses. Under those conditions, the unknown becomes more visible, not because the universe changes its rules, but because the ordinary frameworks we rely on begin to strain. People notice what peace allows them to ignore. They become intimate with error, coincidence, and the narrow margins separating knowledge from guesswork. In that sense, mystery is not a side effect of war. It is one of its hidden climates. Scientists, historians, and survivors have each approached these events from different angles. One looks for mechanism, another for evidence, another for meaning. None of these approaches is complete on its own. The machine can explain a signal, but not the feeling of seeing it. The archive can confirm a timeline, but not the inner dislocation of living through it. To understand wartime mysteries, we must hold both realities together, the measurable and the human. That balance matters now more than ever. We live in a world still shaped by that conflict, still surrounded by technologies descended from its urgencies, still tempted to believe that better tools will free us from uncertainty. Yet the record of World War II suggests something humbler. Progress expands our reach, yes, but it does not abolish ambiguity. It simply gives ambiguity new forms. Perhaps that is the quiet revelation waiting inside these stories. Not that history is full of secrets waiting to be conquered, but that human beings have always lived at the border between explanation and wonder. We cross that border whenever certainty falters. And sometimes in the flicker between what happened and what can be proved, we glimpse not failure but the unfinished nature of understanding itself. It started, in the end, with ordinary people trying to speak carefully about extraordinary things. A radar operator describing a mark that should not have been there. A pilot remembering a light that moved with impossible patience. A sailor recalling the final coordinates of a ship the sea would not return. A scientist admitting that the deeper matter was examined, the less comforting reality appeared. These were not always people seeking mystery. Often they were people trained to resist it, to sort observation from imagination, data from rumor, signal from noise. That is what gives their stories such enduring weight. Not that they offer easy answers, but that they reveal the dignity of uncertainty. Again and again, during the war, human beings were brought to the edge of what they could verify. Some responded with theory, some with silence, some with a memory repeated over decades, not because they wished to sensationalize the past, but because the past had left them with a question that refused to fade. In this way, the mysteries of World War II are not only about unexplained events, they are about the ethics of witness. What do we do with an experience that feels true but remains incomplete? How do we honor testimony without surrendering judgment? How do we stay faithful both to evidence and to the fragile humanity of those who live through what evidence cannot fully capture? Perhaps the answer lies in restraint. We do not need to turn every uncertainty into myth, nor do we need to flatten every mystery into mechanics so quickly that its human resonance disappears. There is wisdom in holding open a space between those extremes, where curiosity remains disciplined and compassion remains intact. As this story moves toward its close, that may be the most important thread to carry forward. The war did not only test weapons, nations, and ideologies, it tested perception itself. It revealed how often reality exceeds the systems built to contain it, and how memory continues searching long after the event is gone. And maybe that is why these mysteries still feel alive. They are not asking us to believe more. They are asking us to listen better, to the record, to the silence around the record, and to the human voice standing somewhere between certainty and wonder, still trying to tell the truth as honestly as it can. So where does that leave us? After all the vanished signals, the strange lights, the broken instruments, the altered memories, and the long silences left behind by war. It leaves us where history often does when it is approached with patience rather than certainty, in the company of human limitation. World War II remains one of the most studied events in modern history, examined through archives, testimony, science, and remembrance. And yet, even here, in one of the most documented eras ever lived, there are moments that resist full explanation. Not because truth does not exist, but because human beings encounter truth through fragments, through damaged records, partial perspectives, fallible senses, and memories shaped by survival. That is not a weakness in history. It is its deepest honesty. The unresolved mysteries of the war remind us that knowledge is never merely a collection of answers. It is also a practice of humility. We learn by comparing records, testing claims, and questioning stories, yes. But we also learn by recognizing that some experiences remain larger than the frameworks we build around them. A radar ghost may become a lesson in atmospheric physics. A wartime light may yield to natural explanation. A missing vessel may eventually be found resting on the ocean floor. And still, something human remains unresolved. What it felt like to be there, to face the unknown without the comfort of hindsight. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate across generations. They do not simply ask what happened in the war. They ask what happens to people when the world becomes unstable, when certainty falters, when reality itself seems to blur at the edges. They ask how we remember honestly without pretending to know more than we do. They ask whether mystery is always a problem to be solved, or sometimes a boundary that teaches us how to see more carefully. In the end, these wartime enigmas are not really about darkness hidden in the past. They are about the enduring human effort to bring light to what we do not fully understand. And maybe that is the final truth waiting beneath all the others. That memory, like history, is not valuable because it is perfect. It is valuable because it keeps us searching for meaning, for context, for one another. Across time, across silence, across all that has been lost, we continue to ask our questions, not to conquer the unknown completely, but to remain human in its presence.